A lot of misconceptions about leadership, and one of the biggest misconceptions of all about leadership is not a person. Leadership is an activity, and that activity is how do you organize people and get them to come together and work together for a common goal. The thing about leadership is it's highly situational. Nobody can be a generic leader for all situations. Some people are more skilled than others, but you may not have the most optimal leader for a situation. And this is why you see it in sporting teams, that someone might be good at one team, but then horrible with the next. Another thing is just because you're a good coach doesn't mean you're going to make a good general manager. And you see it with companies too. Guys with one company are absolutely fantastic, go to a different company and nothing. So the thing about leadership is it greatly varies. And some examples of some of the great leaders have been like Bob Galvin of Motorola. His style was he was a consensus builder. Unfortunately, Bob Galvin Jr. was also an excellent CEO, but then they got to Chris Galvin and finally things fell too far from the tree. Jack Welch built up GE. Jack Welch is still highly critical of GE's. He's become the cranky old man telling people to get off his lawn. Jack Welch was a chainsaw, and that's what you need to do to make an elephant move. And Lou Gerstner of IBM, when IBM was in trouble and everybody was talking about breaking it up and all, Lou Gerstner was the one who realized, look, you have to be who you are. And so Gerstner essentially realized that, look, technology is always going to need a lot of pieces. So instead of breaking these pieces apart where we can get picked off one by one, let's stay together and offer a new level of services. William Ruckelshaus is one of the great leaders. Ruckelshaus's claim to fame is that he was Assistant Attorney General of the United States. And so when Nixon started whacking the special prosecutor, and then he gave it to Ruckelshaus next and told him to fire the special prosecutor, Ruckelshaus quit. Later on, Ruckelshaus was put in charge of the EPA. Now, one problem a lot of communities have is that they're polluting themselves, so these businesses need to go away. On the other hand, if those businesses go away, then the community's dead because they rely on that money from that company. So what do? And Ruckelshaus basically came into the situation. He did absolutely nothing. And they were furious with him. They said, this isn't leadership and all. But what Ruckelshaus understood is in this situation, the government can't come in and dictate to people what to do. Because the moment the government leaves, then the whole thing falls apart. This is a kind of situation when you have large communities that working bottoms up as opposed to dictating from top down works better. Actually, the EPA gets a very bad rap in a lot of ways. The EPA, they'll work with you. And for that matter, so does the FDA, so do a lot of agencies. They're not out to put you out of business, but they want you to get into compliance. George Kane of Abbott Laboratories, let's see, if you put $5,000 into Abbott Laboratories, 20 years later you would have ended up with like 10 million. The average growth for Abbott Laboratories under George Kane was 22% a year. George Kane wasn't a big ego guy, quiet man, incredibly focused, understood how to work with people, and subsequently he's a CEO you never hear about. And for those of you who read the book Good to Great know all about George Kane. So in terms of the authority, the power that a leader has, it's either given to you by the people that you're leading, or it's compulsory, meaning you force them to do it. And so naturally the best authority you can have is if people respect you. They'll listen to you, they'll follow you. The next level is you have a personal relationship or connection with them. There's perception, and that perception of power comes from relationships or their stature. For example, if you met President Crow on the street, you would just think, he's just an average, guy. On the other hand, you find out he's president of ASU, all of a sudden your perception changes. You're indentured, meaning by contract or previous agreement, you have to agree. And it could be due to your position that there's a direct line of authority that you have to follow. In terms of influencing others, you could do it through power, meaning you can terminate them, you can reduce their salary, you basically control their situation and their job. You can give them incentives, and by giving them incentives, they typically will work in the short term. Long-term incentives and repeated incentives don't work. If you have repeated incentives, what ends up happening is that people will start to look at it as being an entitlement, and so it loses all its power. We had a profit sharing, and in that profit sharing, everybody got a bonus at Christmas time, and then one year they didn't give it out because we didn't make a profit, and people were all angry. Well, we need to make a profit. And finally, the best kind of way you can influence others is if you can inspire them in some way, that they're motivated by the mission. The thing in a startup, power works to prevent chaos at a single moment, meaning power is about taking somebody out and shooting them. And I've actually done that before. We had a major change. People were really upset. People were changed. Certain managers got removed. And somebody started speaking up, and I fired him on the spot. And all of a sudden, everybody was like, whoa. Okay, I got everybody's attention. But the thing about inspiration is if they believe in what's going on, then they're willing to fight for the person next to them. People are inspired by each other. They feel rewarded. This is a way you build up long-term leadership and long-term influence over people. These are the 9 kinds of CEOs I've seen in startups, and you can read it all. You've probably run into many of them. And if you notice, there is no one perfect one. The thing about the people who are grounded, who are a good scale, who are just strong leaders in general, guess what? These are the people who tend not to self-promote. They have an air of modesty about them. And so this was the problem with the book Good to Great. And a friend of mine said, well, isn't this a wake-up call for everyone that we should change the way we do business? And I said, it's not going to happen. And the reason why is the person who gets the most exposure is the one who typically wins. And so because there's no perfect CEO, a CEO is going to have weaknesses. And so you need to put a team together to address those weaknesses. One area where I break with E&I here at ASU is like the class FSC 301, some of you have taken it, is they make you out and go out and sell. And they said every entrepreneur has to know how to sell. And I disagree with it. I disagree with it because sales is a very specific skill. 90% of the people are lousy at it. 10% of the people are actually quite good at it. Guess what? I know I'm a mediocre salesman. Why on earth should I keep forcing myself to try to sell? I'm just going to find somebody else who's good at it. I mean, that's the point of a startup. You want to find the best people to do the best work. You don't want to settle for mediocrity. But you have to understand who you are. And so these are the kinds of things that you can do to help you build up a strong team. And so in terms of your employees, what do you look for? One thing I always laugh about in career offices, they give you like the 100 most likely questions they'll ask you during an interview and stuff like that. And the reality is every employee pretty much comes down to 3 things. One is skills. Can you actually do the job that you've been hired to do? The next is culture. Do you fit into the culture of the company? And there are different kind of cultures. I didn't fit in well in a large corporate culture for the simple reason I'm a gunslinger. I'm not the guy who's going to fall into line with hierarchy and all. I'm going to do what's right. On the other hand, I've been in cultures where everybody swore like sailors. I have had friends who worked in investment banking companies, and they pretty said it's fraternity. And so if you're a female, it's a very uncomfortable environment to be in. And so how do you fit into that culture? And finally, there's added value. And that's, is there something extra? What makes you unique? Is there something that you bring to the table that I'm not going to find anywhere else? And those are the three things when they're hiring people that they look for. So if you were interviewing with me, this is what you would go through. The first thing I'm going to do is tack your resume. Why? Because everybody posts up their resume, and I'm going to see if you know exactly what's going on. For example, everybody says they're in engineering that they know statistical process control. And so I'll ask you like a question like the average and standard deviation are constant. But what we're seeing is positive skew and a higher kurtosis. What does that mean? Should I be concerned about that? And so you pretty much need to know what you're doing in order to answer that. And then cultural questions like pop quiz questions. Like if there's something brutally wrong, how do you handle people? Do you get into their face, or do you just kind of back off? And finally, what added value they can bring. But this determines whether or not you're a fit. In terms of you being a manager, good managers, now granted in a startup you don't have this opportunity, but as your startup matures you should think about it. And that's that good managers have a succession plan in place. I always have. And it's because you have a responsibility to the investors in the company. And this is if you get run over by a car tomorrow, what happens to your department? Will it run without you? For that matter, I'm the kind of person where something happens to me, I actually have a folder and a file for my wife telling her everything she needs to do financially. And this is how to settle our estate, and these are the accounts and everything else. And that's because I've been through it. I've closed 3 estates, and it's horrible because people don't prepare for when they croak. And this is a succession plan. I don't want my wife to go through that, so I put that together for her. The thing is, a lot of people don't like to think about these things. People think, oh, it's bad juju to think about death and all. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be death. It's like, what if you quit the company and all? Do you want the company to suffer and go under, or do you want to have a plan in place so they can continue to execute? And so some of the considerations in succession is think about your strategic roadmap. Who will fit it best into this? Do you have talent within the company? For example, Arthur Rock at Intel, he pretty much said in order, these are the most important people, Noyce, Moore, and Grove. And he said in that order. Subsequently, the successions of CEOs. First it was Noyce, then it was Moore, and then it was Grove. Retaining, when there's change, your talent can walk out the door. How do you want to retain them? And finally, how do you make that change as seamless as possible? So your business keeps going on, and especially in a startup where you have a lot of turmoil. That's very important. And so these are some of the things you think about when you're thinking about succession, the competencies, the positions around the talent, and your execution. And so a lot of companies fail at this because when there's turmoil, they haven't really thought this through. And so they just kind of plug people in place, so they hire from the outside, and then the whole thing just falls apart. Harvesting. This is our last topic. Yeah, this video is going to be longer. Harvesting is something you should consider at the start. It's your final objective. And I'm amazed when you talk to people like, well, how are you going to harvest this company? And they go, oh, I don't know. But it's something you should think about from the beginning, because your investors want to know how this thing is going to harvest. How are they going to get their money back? And so if you're not thinking about them, then you're not a caretaker of their investment. And not only that, but your employees want to know when you can harvest because they're taking a pay cut. This is what they're betting on. They've bet on the lottery ticket. Well, when can I cash this lottery ticket in? So why would you want to leave your company? You get burned out. The company has financial issues and you're not the right person to get them out of it. For some people, they sacrifice a lot for their families. Some people are actually sincere when they say, I'm leaving because of my family. You're rich on paper, but you're not liquid. And so you might finally decide this is it, this is the time. It's time to, buy that yacht and go to Tahiti. You might get bored. I get bored. This is why I've bounced between so many different kinds of jobs, because I need to be stimulated. And so maybe there are new horizons that you want to go after. And there's also, you might realize, something, I'm not the best guy suited for this. I can't take the company to the next level. It's time they find someone else who can. And a good example of that is David Lam. David Lam created a great semiconductor equipment company. David Lam sold out for about $30 million. Lam Enterprises is now worth over $1 billion. And people thought, well, gee, David Lam cashed out too early. But no, David Lam was a humble guy. David Lam thought, $30 million is enough for anybody. And so he just wanted to go on and just live his life. Some things you want to consider is take your team into account. How are they going to feel? What's the long-term vision for your enterprise? And this is where the succession plan comes in. And also, if you're trying to sell or do a financial deal, what is the health of the market? And that's it. If it's a down market, guess what? This is not the right time to be thinking about this. On the other hand, if the market is really inflated, like right now, maybe it's time to make a move. And is there some event that's going to trigger you to wanting to go ahead and do this? And so, what are my options in harvesting? I can keep it. My free cash flow is great. It's pouring in. I can reinvest in the business, and I can just keep going. I enjoy what I do. Steve Jobs never wanted to leave Apple, and he literally died on at the job for all intents and purposes. You have other investors. Maybe you just want to own it for your own, so you buy out. And so this is where you're looking at different buyout options, whether it's leverage, employee, or whatever. I decided I'm just going to sell the company. I'm going to wash my hands of it. And the thing about strategic sales is people in your supply chain, your customers, these are all potential people who might want your business. IPO. Private equity groups. These are guys who buy businesses simply for the profit. The problem is, in certain cases, they leverage the assets of the company that they're going to purchase to help secure the loan for the purchase. And this is what's happening to Toys R Us right now. The thing is, Toys R Us was perfectly profitable. And once they took on all this debt, it pretty much sank the ship. That's a lesson. Get rid of debt. Be debt-free. Minimizing debt gives you options. Having debt doesn't. IPO. There is only one reason why you should have an initial public offering. You are going to be a growth enterprise. If you are a publicly traded stock, the only reason for you to exist is because you are going to grow. You are going to create shareholder value. If that's not what you're about, then you should be a private business. A good example is Dell Computer. Michael Dell, in the early going, Dell was a growing computer and they stopped growing. The thing is, they were still a cash cow. They were still producing $1 billion worth of cash every year. They just weren't growing anymore. So Michael Dell took them private. You want to keep it in the family, so you're going to pass it down. And that's, a personal thing to see whether or not your family's actually interested. And there are negative harvesting events. Maybe you're harvesting because you're going under. And so it's time to go away. So summarizing this lecture up, risk is about probability and damage. And so you have different options to get around that. There is no ideal leader, and this is why you need to understand what your weaknesses are. A lot of great CEOs of startups have fantastic strengths. The question is their weaknesses going to be what finally kills the company? And so harvest is something that you should be thinking about at the beginning. How do you envision actually coming to that point where you can get value out of the company?